Welcome. This is Ken Gosnell with CEO Experience. Today at our CEO conversation, we're honored to have Dee Ann Turner. She is the author of the book Bet on Talent, and she writes specifically about how any corporation or company can improve their performance by developing a healthy corporate culture. So, Dee Ann, we're delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you, Ken. It's certainly my pleasure to be with all of you, and I thank you for taking the time those who are listening in for taking the time to join us today.
Well, as I mentioned, I love your latest book, Bet on Talent. I think obviously the corporate culture piece is extremely important in finding the right people. Can you tell us a little bit about why you wrote the book and tell us a little bit about how companies can bet on talent?
Sure. Well, there's quite a story behind that book. It really started as another book several years ago. I released a book in November of 2015 called It's My Pleasure. And that was really my love letter to Chick-fil-A about what I had learned about the most important decisions a leader makes, people decisions. And I learned that from Truett Cathy, the founder of Chick-fil-A. He passed away in September 2014, and after working with him all those years, I felt like it was really important, all of us who worked with him, to remember why he thought Chick-fil-A was so successful. And he felt that way because we made great people decisions. And so that was the first audience. The second audience, and the reason I wrote that original book was because I wanted the thousands of people already in the 6 years since he's been gone, the people who would come after him, to know what he thought was important so that Chick-fil-A could continue on into multiple generations. And so that was the original reason for writing It's My Pleasure. That publisher went out of business and Baker Books came along and they bought the rights to It's My Pleasure and asked me to rewrite it, to update it, add some more material, and particularly to talk about some other organizations besides Chick-fil-A. So I did that, and Bet on Talent was released in September of 2019. So that's quite a backstory to how we got there.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think is so important is you talk about obviously what you saw at Chick-fil-A, but now that you've been around with other companies as well, the importance of talent and hiring the right talent, finding the right talent. I guess a question that I've heard a lot of times and I would ask is why do you think so many companies tolerate poor performance or bad employees? What's your what do you counsel companies to think about? Because sometimes people tolerate what they can get rather than maybe what they want.
Right. Well, sometimes it's become the path of least resistance. But the real reason I think that happens is because people do something, they hire people. They hire people. And so
Right.
I would suggest that we never do that again. And instead, we select talent. And
Wow.
there's a huge difference. When
Mhm.
we talk about hiring people, we're talking about getting warm bodies on the job. Whoever we can get to fill a shift or a new role or making sure we have enough. It's all about quantity. But when we select talent, we select a specific person for a very specific role that has all the skills and abilities to do that role and more beyond that. And is a totally different mindset. And when you take the time and you're patient to select talent instead of just hire people, it gives you this long-term sustainability of your people practices.
Right. Well, but boy, that's a great insight. And, I think that's what Jesus did, right? It wasn't about just, hey, I've got 12 disciples I've got to fill. He went out and selected those individuals that he wanted to come alongside him for the journey. So I think that's
It's
a
a
good
great
takeaway.
analogy. Yeah.
What surprised you most as you wrote the book? Was there something that you discovered about yourself, or maybe something about Chick-fil-A, or maybe just in general as you looked out of the landscape of human resources and corporate culture?
There were so many things that I learned. Tim Tassopoulos, the current president of Chick-fil-A, he asked me after I'd written the original book, he said, how did you do this? Did you just keep notes all these years? And actually, I didn't. It was what was in my brain. And I had no idea all that stuff was just packed in until I started writing about it. And it really flowed out. That was one thing I learned. In writing Bet on Talent, I learned that it doesn't matter what age you are or how much experience you have, you can learn a lot more.
Mhm.
And I did writing the book. I learned more about other organizations, obviously, but I just learned some skills that are required in writing a book that I had never really honed. And what happened was I wanted to outsource some of that work and I couldn't find anybody. And I said, well, I'm going to do it myself. And there's such a great feeling of pride when you've learned to do something you've never done before, especially when you're in the, the latter part of your career. And it's like, oh, I can do this. So we can always learn something new.
I think that's fantastic. One of my life goals is to learn something new on my last day of Earth, right? And and I know I'm going to accomplish it because it's going to be my first day in heaven. So,
Well, if we quit learning, I think we're pretty much done. So it's good to keep learning.
hey, one of the questions we get, and I wanted to ask, since you mentioned about your book, and I know you're writing another book already or just finished that. Do you have a book writing process, or what? I know we have some people that would love to write some books as well. So what do you recommend in that process?
Sure. Well, the first thing I like to tell people is only write a book if you feel called to write a book.
Hmm.
Sometimes I hear people say, I'm supposed to or I should. And I really think writing a book and writing in general is a calling, just like everything else. So I wouldn't put myself in a corner to do something that's not a natural gift and a natural desire to do something like that just because you feel like you have to do that. So that's number one. But secondly, start with the end in mind. I learned that from Stephen Covey. And understand what you want the end to be. The way I wrote both of my books, or all three of my books so far, is I wrote the introduction and the conclusion first, and then I wrote an outline that filled in everything in between of how we got from the beginning to the end. And I followed that outline, and I didn't always in every book I wrote, I did not write in the sequence. I wrote what was on my heart at the time. And I think you see that when you read my books. It's a lot more, you've got the tactics there, but the heart's really there. And it was because I would write what was on my heart at the time. So I might write chapter 6 long before I wrote chapter 2. It just depended on what hit me at a certain time. And then the process of writing, people have to find when they're most creative. So for me, what I would do is get up in the morning and I'd have my prayer time and then exercise. And then I'd go sit down in my office and I would write until the creativity ran dry, which was usually 3 or 4 hours. And then I was done for the day and I went and did something else. Other people like to write in the middle of the night or late at night. I don't have a creative thought at that time of day. And so you have to find your best creative time, invest in that, and then don't overdo it. So you need to give yourself a long time. If you're like me and you're on a book contract, it's like, okay, if I've got to arrive on April 1st, then I have to back that up to what does that look like for 3 or 4 hours a day for how long?
Right, right. Well, can you give us a little insight into the new book you just finished? I'd love to.
Sure. Well, this is a little bit of a reverse. I've been working with and talking to leaders all this time about creating remarkable cultures and selecting extraordinary talent. And now I'm going to talk to the talent. And this book is Crush Your Career, Ace the Interview, Land the Job, Launch Your Future. And this book actually started as a funny thing. I wrote for Fox News a couple years ago. I started writing. It was a 3-part series on career advice I give to my own children. And so that was how this started. And I had written, and it really became a few chapters of the book. And then the publisher picked up on that and they said, that's what we want you to write about. And I said, well, that's not what I want to write. I want to keep talking to leaders because these young people don't need this book. They kept saying, they don't need it. They've got all the jobs to choose from. And then lo and behold, we're in the middle of a global pandemic and we're in the United States, 26 million people, unfortunately, are without a job. And so I'm really grateful that this is what they asked me to write. It's very tactical. I hope it helps people find their original calling, find a new calling, transition to what's next. And the book goes from part-time work to retirement. So it covers the whole lifespan of employment. And I hope that a lot of folks will find it helpful.
Wow. I think that's called God's favor, that he positioned you in such a time as this, right? That you are going to be able to speak into the marketplace. So that's fantastic. I got to ask, since I've got a 25 and 22-year-old, what is one piece of advice you've given your kids or that might show up in the book?
Oh, there's tons of it. They're really tactical things about how you manage situations at work and how you conduct yourself in an interview, et cetera, how to find a job.
Wow.
But my favorite story is really in the introduction of the book about how it all really came to be. that really energized me to write this book. And my youngest son was on the phone with me one night, and we had had several conversations over months. He's a sophomore in college, and he's very enthusiastic and committed to his future. And he reminds me a lot of me when I was 20 years old. And I could feel the anxiousness in him sometimes about his future and about, are all these plans going to come together? And finally, one night, I was out of answers, because being leaders, we like to fix everything, and especially like to fix things for our children. And finally, I just said to him, I said, son, how can I help?
Mm.
And he said, just tell me it's going to be okay.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, that's all? Because it is going to be okay. Even in these horrible circumstances as we record this interview and visit with these folks today. And, that's, to me, that's the most important piece of advice. It's like, okay, here's a blueprint for you. And especially when we have faith, that's the bottom line, is having faith. And when you have faith, and here's a blueprint of how to get to point A to point Z, have that faith, and it will be okay. And there'll be rough roads, and there'll be challenges, and just like the challenges that we're in, and we'll have to be resilient, and we'll grow, but it'll be okay.
Wow. What a great word. Thanks. Thank you for Dee Ann for that. I look forward to that new book. I do think that you write with passion and heart. That's one of the reasons I love your books. I can see the calling. And I think that's a good analogy that you put on it, that you are anointed, or, you've been blessed with experiences and education, and, your heart really comes out in the book. So I just encourage you to keep writing, because I think what you write about is fantastic. In the book, Bet on Talent, one of my favorite components of the book is where you talk about corporate chemistry or team chemistry, and finding people that align so that you create this energy together. Can you talk a little bit about chemistry and how important that is when you're looking for talent, and really how important it is for the success of an organization?
Sure. This is actually, if anything I had more insight about later in my career, it would be this issue of chemistry. Because early on, when I thought about selecting for chemistry, I thought about selecting for people who get along well together, who I personally like,
Right.
if I'm going to select them. And it's good for people to get along, and it's good when the boss likes their employees and the employees like the boss. All those things are good things. But later in my career, I really came to understand what chemistry is. And this is what it is. It's people who will bring their differences to the table, but they're aligned enough that they can bring those differences and still collaborate with everyone else. So,
Mm.
for example, let's take a key component of a remarkable culture. One of those key components is demonstrated core values.
Mm.
So, if you bring people into your organization who, like, for instance, at Chick-fil-A, our number one core value was, we're here to serve. So if everybody comes in with understanding, hey, I align with the value that I'm here to serve. I'm here to serve those who serve customers. I'm here to serve the customer if that's my role. I'm here to serve. But I might have some different ideas about how we get there. But because we're aligned on on the baseline, then I can bring those ideas. I can bring my diverse opinions, and I can collaborate with everyone else. That's great chemistry. Great chemistry is not when everyone thinks alike and gets along. And because all that'll do, I don't know if you remember the Jack Strayer years ago, the buffalo example of leading you follow the buffalo and you go right off the cliff. And that's what happens if you have chemistry where everyone's thinking alike. But if the sweet spot of chemistry is when diverse people can come together and collaborate together to bring the best solutions to the organization.
So does a leader have to like everybody on their leadership team, or every employee? I mean, they could have good chemistry, but still not like a person. I mean, maybe they could respect opinions. How do you
Now,
recommend?
like's a hard word. I don't think any of us want to work with people we don't like. I think there's a big difference between like and chemistry.
Mm.
Um, Not liking people can be difficult, because I think that does create personality issues, which I don't think chemistry is. I think if you can like somebody and respect that they have a difference of opinion. I'll give you an example. And this happened to me a couple of times. But working with people for a long, long time, I built some close relationships with my employees, and there can be a variety of issues you disagree about, and that we were, and I'm going to be even transparent enough to say it was the year of a presidential election. It's been a number of years ago, so it wasn't recent, but it was a number of years ago, and we were at dinner in Chicago. We were at a conference together, and we had a close enough relationship that I said, "Hey, I just don't get it why you think how you think, but I want to hear you out. I want you to, will you explain to me why you support this point of view?" And she was so great to explain it to me. And you know what? I was never going to agree with her because that wasn't my point of view. But the respect I had for her point of view and understanding why she brought what she did made all the sense in the world once I listened to her. And by the way, in turn, she listened to me and really understand why I came from the perspective that I did. So here were two people. We had very different perspectives, respected each other. And when you're in HR, those kinds of issues will come into the table, will come to the table, and be business issues too. We could respect each other's differences, and we genuinely liked each other. But had we not liked each other, I think that would have been hard.
Mm,
And so I struggle with that whole concept of do I like everybody? It would be better. We would have better relationships if we liked each other, but that's not all the way it's the case. So at the core, people need to they need to have a purpose that matches the organizational purpose. They need to have a mission that matches you know, where they want to, their goals, and align those goals with the organization, and core values that resonate with one another. I don't think you necessarily have to like each other, but when those things match up, I think you find that a lot of times you do like each
right. Yeah, and you talk a lot in the book about how great companies go to great lengths to figure out that chemistry, whether they're
other.
multiple interviews or, it's just trying to unpack, does this person fit in? So they may be different, there may be a diversity, but
Right.
there's a level of, we're after the same thing. Can you talk just a little bit about some of those best practices that you've seen?
Sure. And that takes time, and that's what people aren't willing to do, especially in with the employment situation we were just in before this pandemic hit. We needed people so badly that people weren't willing to take the time to be sure that chemistry was there. And when you're selecting talent, if you want a long-term relationship, you don't want them just to for that choice to be, the choice is only 50% yours. The other 50% is their choice. And so they need time to understand your organization to make sure that they can make the decision. Yeah, I align with this culture. This culture matches me, and I can buy into this and contribute there. And sometimes that's what we don't want to spend time doing to really understand if there's chemistry there or not.
Mhm. Well, I want to just ask this question because you were at Chick-fil-A for over 30 years, 35 years. You worked with Truett and Dan and a lot of the leadership there. You were one of the first women, I think, in the executive leadership role, and you were probably surrounded by a lot of men. Can you talk a little bit about the difference of the chemistry between men and women? And did you know right away that chemistry with Chick-fil-A worked? I mean, 35 years was a long time to be in one
Yeah.
place.
Well, and if when and it was actually, just to be technical, it was 33 years for me at Chick-fil-A, but to stay that long at some place, it changed over time. There were different things that attracted and connected for me.
Mm,
When I went there early on and I was young, I was attracted to the corporate purpose. That fit my personal purpose really well. I mean, this was an organization whose purpose is to glorify God by being a faithful steward of all that's entrusted to them, and to be a positive influence on all who come in contact with Chick-fil-A. That resonated with me personally of what I wanted to do way before I even knew that's what was connecting to my heart, so to speak.
mm,
So I love that part. As I grew in my career, I really loved the fact that it was a place where I could learn and develop. They invested tremendously in my learning and development. The umbrella over all that, the entire 33 years I was there, was the way that people cared about me there. So all of that was different at different times. Now, the chemistry is really interesting. So I grew up with a brother. I didn't have a sister. We were blessed with three sons and two male dogs. So let's just be real straight that my whole life has been about being around men. And I'm a big cheerleader for men, obviously, raising three sons. So it actually was, as we started to grow, we had more female executives. I actually had to learn that because I had grown up and those men had been my mentors. I didn't have female mentors. And so I learned to, I mean, I tried to bring, the differences that I had, but at the same time, I learned to be somewhat no nonsense like them. I wasn't particularly, I had emotion, but I didn't, I wasn't overly emotion and those things. So I really learned the way they did things. And I found that the chemistry struggles came later as I learned to mix more as we added female executives. And I wasn't the only one anymore.
Well, at CEO Experience, we do have a woman, we have women CEOs, and we have a women CEO retreat days where just women CEOs get together, and then we have some that are mixed. Can you give any advice to women executives? Should they be like the men? Should they be different? I mean, obviously we believe in embracing their talents and gifts, but what did you learn through your career, just out of this curiosity? And I had several women asked me to ask this question. So
Sure. Well, first of all, I believe that every human being should be exactly who God created them to be. And so I don't think that, just because that's the way I felt in my early career of trying to figure out how to navigate myself. And I said, hey, I became more like them, but I think we all need to be who we are and to be who we were created to be, number one. And to bring those talents and skills to the table. And I'm going to be really blunt. In this day and age, if you can't be who you are and bring your character, competency, and chemistry to the table and that fit in your organization, then I think it's time to say, is this the right fit for me? Because I don't think that I don't think any organization should want somebody who's pretending to be someone else. They're not bringing the best of what they have. So hopefully a great selection process helps the organization and the individual determine the right fit there, and that it is the fit where that person can be exactly who they are and grow in that organization.
Well, I think that's the benefit of diversity too, right? That, as Jesus went around to different towns and villages, he interacted with lots of different people with lots of different values, lots of different backgrounds. And I think as a leader, bringing in those diverse teams, appreciating the gifts and talents and the abilities that each person has is really critical for us. And so, embracing our gifts, understanding where somebody else might be different, and but really appreciating that, like you said. And I really appreciate your comment about, if we can't do that someplace, or we're not allowing, sometimes we're CEOs, we need to think about, am I allowing my team to do that? Just tying the bow on the chemistry conversation, one of the things that I find incredibly intriguing about the Chick-fil-A culture, and pretty amazing, quite honestly, is each of the stores are independent contractors. And so they're allowed to do their own hiring for their employees. And yet there's such a consistency across with Chick-fil-A's all over the country. Can you explain how you guys handled that, or how you teach your operators to hire well?
That's a great question. And you picked up on that exactly. Not only can they select their own people, they have to select and manage their own people. There's a clear line there that as I led at Chick-fil-A, and I assume that's still the case today, they don't cross because of franchise law. So they do make all those decisions for themselves. And that consistency of customer experience, I think, comes from two things. The number one thing, I mentioned this early on, what I learned from Truett Cathy was that people decisions are the most important decisions that leaders make. And of all the people decisions that I made at Chick-fil-A, who we gave the keys to the restaurant to was the very most important decision.
Wow.
And so that's where a lot of the consistency comes from, is the selection of those franchisees over time. And when you select the right leader, then they in turn select the right people in their organization and grow those people. So now when I consult with clients, the very first thing we talk about, if we're trying to improve their culture or strengthen their culture, is we go right into, who is that key individual? If it's in manufacturing, a lot of times it's the plant manager. That's the equivalent to the franchisee. It's like you have to change how you're selecting, growing, developing, even compensating those people if you want to flip the whole culture. And so for Chick-fil-A, that franchisee has been the very center of that consistency that you see. And then the organization brings in brand standards around the customer experience.
Mm.
But here's what's funny at Chick-fil-A. From the very beginning, Truett always really tried to lead with principles. He tried to make rules something that he didn't use many of. And so when most people went into business with Chick-fil-A early on, with Truett, they had 3 rules. And he told them, don't open on Sunday, don't change the menu, and put the money in the bank. And those were the rules. And so as time went on and these brand standards around customer service started talking about these things, well, the franchisees saw them as suggestions, not as rules. And that happened with the my pleasure comment. I don't know how many of your listeners know this story, but we learned that from the Ritz-Carlton chain. Truett would spend time there, and when he would go there and say thank you, the employees would say my pleasure. And Truett loved to hear that from them. And he thought, wow, that'd be great if that was in my restaurant. Because he would, at the time, he would hear a lot of when a guest would say thank you, the young person might respond with no problem. And he really didn't like that because, of course, it's no problem to serve, right? So he showed up at the annual conference one year and he told a long version of what I just told you. And he asked all the franchisees that when the guest said thank you, he'd like the team members to say, my pleasure. Well, we went away from there and nothing changed. Now, we don't have time for me to tell you this whole story, but let's just suffice to say it went on for 10 years. He came back every year and asked the same thing. And in the 10th year, he stood at the podium and very uncharacteristically slammed his fist down on the podium. He said, now I mean it. When your guest says, thank you, I want your team members to say my pleasure. Well, after that, his son, Dan Caffey, now the CEO of Chick-fil-A, he said, I think Dad means it. And so we began this rule of saying my pleasure. Well, the franchisees were smarter because they knew if they went back to their restaurants and they taught these team members this rule. Now, when a guest says thank you, say my pleasure. Be sure you say my pleasure. Say my pleasure, because Truett could come in and you didn't say my pleasure and we'll get in trouble. They didn't do that. They taught them the principle behind it. It's our pleasure to serve. And the reason it's our pleasure is because without these customers, we don't have a business. We don't have a paycheck. We don't get promotions. We don't have team outings. We don't have parties. We don't have scholarships. We don't have any of these things. So it is our pleasure to serve. And then the really phenomenal nature is which the team members took that on and really incorporated it into their language and backed it up with the second mile service that they deliver to their guests.
Wow. Yeah, I love that. I appreciate that story because it tells us the importance of, again, the wisdom of others. And here Truett learned that from the hotel industry, the hospitality business, and yet he brought that into the restaurant business. And it's something to be said from learning from other industries, right? Hey, a question that I wanted to ask, and then it ties to an HR question. I know we love people, it's all about people. We recognize, I think most of us, the value of finding good talent. And we know that our organizations perform better when we have good talent. And yet a lot of the issues that we deal with in organizations, and you kind of just mentioned it, are people problems. People either fulfilling their jobs and responsibilities well, or even the problems that they have in themselves and that they bring to work. What have you found, or what would you recommend on how a leader can deal with those people issues? And sometimes when they just get to the end and they say, hey, I can't deal with people for another second. I mean, what recommendations do you have?
Well, first of all, if you're a leader, that is your job, is to quote unquote deal with people, engage with people, lead people, because people are how we get everything done, obviously. And I find that people are about as loyal to you as you are to them. And so one of the things that really helped me in my career was the day that I realized that, I interviewed at some points, probably, I don't know, dozens of candidates a week. It was a big part of my job early on when I was a recruiter. And then I always interviewed a lot of people, but probably dozens. And I stopped to think, you know what, this is just another day in my life, but this is a really important day for this person. And this is somebody's husband or wife, mother or father, son or daughter, brother or sister, this person is special to someone else. And so I need to treat this person the way I would want those special people in my life to be treated. And then as I became a leader, I transferred that thinking to my employees, every one of them. Now, sometimes that probably made me, I'm going to be very transparent as a leader. At times, I probably was a little too paternalistic when I thought that way. But it also helped me remember to be kind and to give second chances and to invest in people in the way I'd want those people to be, the special people in my life to be invested in. And sometimes that meant when I was way over it, I didn't have the luxury to just be over it because those people were entrusted to me. And when I worked in an organization with a corporate purpose that says to be a faithful steward of all that's entrusted to you, well, that's not just the treasure, that's the time and the talent too. And so that was a major part of the purpose of what I was there to do. And so I encourage people, if you can change that mindset a little bit, to think about, okay, I want to treat these people. And then ultimately, you know, I use those words, but ultimately to treat them as Jesus would want you to treat them, right? But that's the mindset that I took that really helped me navigate sometimes when it was difficult and I was just over it.
Right. And it's hard. I mean, dealing with people, sometimes I think even Jesus had times that, you know, obviously he was dealing with lots of problems. I think it's important to just what you were talking about, Dee Ann. I've had to remind myself that of all the things in the business, the only thing that's eternal is people's souls. And so I have an opportunity to connect with them, to to mentor them, to guide them, to lead them, to help navigate. And sometimes even those conversations can help my soul, right? So
Yeah.
those are important conversations to have. And so even though they're difficult, I think they're extremely important. Hey, we're going to have some time for questions. If you had a question, you can send it to me directly on the chat box, or you can put it for everybody to see. Dee Ann, one of the questions that I got was around you were at Chick-fil-A for 33 years. You saw the HR part of that organization bloom and change and grow. You know, we have companies of various sizes. What would one question that I got was when do you start having an HR department? Or what's your recommendation if you're a small company or a startup? And how critical is that, or did you find that to be in Chick-fil-A's success? It wasn't just about marketing. It wasn't just about the food. It really was about the people. And can you talk a little bit about how that really got brought to the conversation?
Sure. And, you know, I often said that I wasn't sure that I could ever work in another HR department in another organization after having that experience at Chick-fil-A.
Wow.
Because if the founder of the company said people decisions are the most important decisions leaders make, he obviously invested a lot in those people decisions. And that meant he had to have a function of people to do that. So, you know, I was trying to think, human resources existed before I did. There was really one other leader of that function before I came to Chick-fil-A. I came in '85, and he had been there since I think '79. So Chick-fil-A was incorporated in '64. I mean, '64, first Chick-fil-A restaurant in '67, and he came in about '76, '77, that or '79, somewhere in that period of time that he came there. So that's how long they went before adding a leader to that. They probably had some staff there before then, but that was when they had a leader at that time. Um, I think that organizations that invest in that, well, let me back up a second. When I came there, I had an interesting experience. There was no budget. I had no separation budget. And you have a bunch of CEOs listening to this conversation. Can you imagine having no
Hello,
separation budget? Okay. And so, but I had a really healthy selection budget.
Generation College bound. How are you?
I'm
Oops.
sorry. I'm sorry. I got it. Hey, Joe Fisher. Oh, there we go. I think we're good.
Okay. So anyway, I had a big selection budget, but not a separation budget. So I asked about this. I said, why is this? And the president of the company, Jimmy Collins, and he said, well, you're not going to need that separation budget. He said, because we put so much focus on selecting the right person to begin with, that you don't need that budget. Now, as Chick-fil-A grew, and I mean, like I said, when I got there, it was about 150 restaurants with 175 million in sales. When I left there, it was 10 billion in sales and over 2,000 restaurants. needless to say, over that time, we did get some money for separation and had some procedures, but it was always far less than what we invested in selection, because we really believed if we had the right people to start with, it would solve a lot of other problems, and it did. So the kind of results from that focus on selection up front, Chick-fil-A enjoyed for over 3 decades, 95% retention rates at corporate staff, 95% retention rates of franchisees, because we invested in the upfront decision. Most organizations won't do that. Most of them want to go fast through that, and they'll make a change if necessary. And so it costs them far more on the back end to reselect talent, to train them, to develop them, to do all those things all over again. If you're able to retain that talent, then you can put that money into great selection procedures and great processes for growing and developing the talent you have, instead of paying for the talent that you're letting go. So I think that's what I learned as part of Chick-fil-A, and I think that contributed tremendously all these years to their success.
Right. I think I think that's great advice. And, I think a lot of companies don't focus on those HR policies because we feel like those are policies that sometimes, especially in startup mode, that, hey, we can get by it. We've got to figure out our sales procedures. We've got to figure out our product development, all those things. But if we don't take the time to really think through what you're just talking about, how do we acquire talent? How do we train them once they're here? Even from the very beginning, boy, we're going to end up having to go back, and it's going to cost us more time later. So I think that's a fantastic reminder.
Well, Ken, talent's going to do all those other things. Talent's going to be your marketing people. Talent's going to be your engineers. Talent's going to, so to invest, that's going to create more innovation in your product line, all of those things when you select great talent. That's the first decision to a lot of other decisions that will follow.
Absolutely. And, even I talk about Jesus, of course, where it talks about his team. And I remind leaders a lot of times, and I'm sure you can relate to this, what you're just talking about, is I said, do you ever think about why Jesus took 3 years in his ministry? Like if it was me and I came down from heaven, I mean, that's a scary thought, but, man, I'd have trained them in a week, right? I mean, I wouldn't have wanted to spend 3 years with those guys. I would have said, hey, a week's good enough. Let me go back to heaven and you guys go. But there were some things I believe, and it's one of the questions I'm going to ask Jesus when I get to heaven, but I believe that there were some things that the disciples could only learn in that first year. And Jesus knew that. And so he stayed with them that first year because he was ready to teach them the things that they needed to learn in the second year. And so there is that process, I believe, that that we have to go through in HR. So, hey, Kim mentioned what I thought was good in your book too. She says she loves the analogy of kind versus nice. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, that was a lesson I learned too from an early boss. And when we're nice, we're really more concerned with what people are thinking about us. But when we're kind, we're thinking more about the other person. There's a big difference between those things. Nice is easier for us. We can be nice, but when we're kind, we tell the truth. We tell people what they need to do. No, we give them direct feedback. We tell them how they can grow, how they can improve. When we're nice, we might just let it go, but that's really not kind to them, is it? And so as leaders, I think it's really important to focus on being kind instead of being nice.
Yeah, that's a great reminder. Hey, we got another question from Mike. He asked, if you had needed to fill a position at Chick-fil-A, but you didn't find your ideal candidate, would you fill it with someone who's all right for the job, or would you keep it vacant until the ideal person came along?
So I can't answer. I have no idea what's happening at Chick-fil-A these days. So I have to give you that caveat. That's not a bad, good, or indifferent. That's just, I haven't done this work now for several years for them. So, but I will tell you how we did it for 30 years at Chick-fil-A. If we didn't find the right candidate in a group for the job, in a group of applicants, we waited till we found the right one, which is very unusual in organizations. Now, I will tell you that even after I went on to lead sustainability at Chick-fil-A and new players came in on the talent side of things, because of what the job market has been in the last 5 to 6 years, that was something that they had to speed up. They didn't have that opportunity. But what they tried to do, rather than settling on a candidate, as I understand it, was that they brought in more applicants. They just cast a wider net to try to get more in to begin with. So the process changed that we probably had smaller applicant pools and we would move on to the next. And later in my career, it moved to a much larger applicant pool to try to speed that process up to match what was happening in the marketplace. But we really didn't believe in settling. It was always about finding the right talent for the role.
Would you ever encourage a company to settle? I mean, is there ever a time that that's appropriate, or what's your best advice or counsel on that? Would you say every job you need to really wait until you find that ideal candidate?
Well, I talk a lot about how we win is we win with who. And winning with who means selecting candidates whose character matches the organization, whose competency matches the role, and whose chemistry matches the team. And everybody is in different situations. And sometimes I tell people you're in the survival mode and you've got to get through the survival mode. In fact, I was telling clients that 2 months ago. You know, it was like, we need people today. And I said, sometimes you have to get through the survival mode. But the cycle that we just went through of this very low unemployment, great economy, I saw that 3 times in my career. And this last cycle was the worst. The great news was the economy was great. The bad news to that was, you know, we know what the unemployment numbers were, and it was hard to find great talent. And what I told people is, you got to survive this cycle, but know if it's cyclical, it's going to happen again. So we can all smile at that. We can't wait till that happens again because we know that means the economy is better. But it's going to happen again. So while you're in the survival mode, you have to start thinking about the culture you have and attracting the talent through improving and strengthening your culture. Because if you're a great organization with a great culture, even when times are tough, people will seek out wanting to work for you. Great talent will want to come work for you. I saw this happen with Chick-fil-A franchisees. Some of them were having a terrible time finding hourly employees, but some of them had people waiting in line for them. And the reason they waited in line is, number one, they had a remarkable culture that they worked on all the time, that they strengthened continuously. Secondly, they recruited all the time. Even when they had enough people, they continued to recruit talent. And they built networks and relationships so that when they did have a job opening, they immediately had somebody that they could go to. And that's how they did it. So what happens is companies often only recruit when they have a need. And really great organizations that have extraordinary talent, they recruit all the time, and they're constantly developing talent. Even if they don't have a spot, they build relationships with people that they know they want to eventually select. I actually saw us do that at Chick-fil-A time and time again, where we didn't have an opening, but we would spot great talent, we'd maintain a relationship, and then when the opportunity came, we were able to attract them to the organization.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I think, again, Jesus shows us with the disciples, sometimes you got to think outside the box and find the person with the right character or attitude. And they may not have any training necessarily, but if they got that character, then we can begin to train them on our processes or our system, but just looking creatively outside. Danielle had a follow-up question. Danielle, I'm going to ask that you ask Dee Ann that question about temporary talent. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ken. Hi, Dee Ann. This is
Hi,
great.
Dan.
One of the things I was thinking about is, would you recommend temporary positions for those survival modes?
I think temporary or contingent workforce is a great way to go sometimes, as long as you're not stringing the candidate along. And so, other words, because I saw this happen sometimes too. You know, somebody wasn't who we wanted to select for a full-time role, so we select them temporary and then just kind of string them along until we found the right person. That, of course, doesn't ethically or feel very right to me. So I think you have to be very clear. We would like to select you for this role for 3 months or whatever time period you want to give. It might be a month, it might be 3 months, whatever it is. Be very clear about that and set very clear expectations. This is for a temporary position. This is going to end on such and such date. And then if you haven't found the new person, what I recommend is that you actually end that temporary relationship, stay to the commitment, and put another temporary person in there so that you don't string that first person along, that you live up to that commitment, which that's a really hard thing to do because you've trained them, But it's really not fair to say, well, you're good enough to work temporary, but we're not going to make you a full-fledged employee with benefits and all that. That doesn't sound fair. So to me, the kind thing to do is to select them, be really clear, this is for this time period. And if you haven't found the candidate that you intend to select for the role, then end the relationship with that contingent worker and start over again.
Excellent.
Thank you. And may I, if I may, she had also addressed the recruiting all the time, and that makes total sense for larger organizations like Chick-fil-A.
Yeah.
So is there a particular model or something that you would suggest for some of the smaller organizations?
Sure. Well, it's really, when I think about a smaller organization, I really think about your networking capacity. So it's really about building relationships everywhere you go. Some of them are online through LinkedIn and other types of platforms like that where you're building relationships. Some of them are in person. It's industry conferences that sometimes you think, I don't need to go hear another talk about X, Y, and Z. You might not, but that's where your talent probably is. So think about all those natural opportunities wherever you are and whatever you're doing. Even if you're the CEO, be wearing your recruiting hat wherever you are. Be looking for talent in every scenario that you're in, leaving that business card, connecting, sending that follow-up email, sending the Christmas card. How are you doing? For that talent that you could see really having someday. It's really just about honing great networking skills for the specific purpose of identifying and attracting talent for when you need it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle.
Dan, I'm getting a lot of questions. When you talk about hiring and looking for talent, one of the questions that we received from Mike was, was it Chick-fil-A's philosophy to hire and keep internal and promote, or did you guys look outside of the company to find the best talent?
So when I worked with Chick-fil-A, that was definitely where we came from early on, is that we did select a lot of internal talent and grow that talent. That was, and I think that was a reflection of our founder. And that was, he had a lot of loyalty to people. And so he liked to see that happen, whether it was franchisees. At the time I worked there, about 65 to 70% of all franchisees had Chick-fil-A experience working in a restaurant. And I have no idea if that continues. I suspect that might be the case. But anyway, a certain percentage. My personal belief is that you've got to have both. I think it's really important to develop internal talent, because I think that helps perpetuate your culture. If it's a culture you want to perpetuate. If you don't, then you probably shouldn't promote from within. But if you have a strong culture, a successful organization, you're trying to continue that, then you want some continuity with your leadership coming from within. But you also never want to become complacent and lack innovation that comes when, we get very comfortable in the organization we're in. So it's good to bring external talent in too. The important thing is that you attract that talent, be sure they're attracted to the very basics of your culture. And then when you get there, you accept them. It's not like they're not going to fit in the same way the person who's grown up here for 30 years. So all of this is very delicate in the way that you're managing it. But I think it's extraordinarily important to have both. Sustaining your culture means promoting from within and growing leadership, but also being prepared for the future and bringing in some innovation comes from bringing in outside talent as well. So being skilled at doing both will make an organization successful.
Excellent. We've only got a few more minutes with Dee Ann, so if you've got any questions on becoming a remarkable corporate culture or hiring, I've got a couple different questions. Go ahead and submit those to me directly or to the chat box. Dee Ann, one of the questions, I know you came from outside the corporate culture. You had it was a journey. I love your story coming into Chick-fil-A. You don't have to tell that. We can let maybe they'll research that a little bit. But one of the questions that we got was whether it was an operator or somebody else that was applying for a position, if Chick-fil-A turned them down, did you guys tell them, here's why we turned you down, or here's a better match? Or did you train, especially people that maybe were applying for multiple times, or that you knew were going to stay there, but they weren't quite ready for that position? Did you have that real authentic conversation about, here's what you need to go and work on? The question was around, did you guys treat it like American Idol, where you voted and said, hey, come back next year, or this is what you need to go work on? But how would you answer that question?
I think the best way for me to answer is to make that a really personal question about how I manage those conversations, because I really can't speak on behalf of other people. But those are conversations that I often had. And sometimes, most of the time, when I think about franchisees, the number one reason I had to say no was a geographic fit. During that time that I was with Chick-fil-A and leading that part of the business, we really like to select people. We selected the location, they still do, and then we found a person for that specific location. Well, at that time, our preference was to select someone from that community or someone who had ties to that community, because we felt like they already had a source of employees and a source of customers, and they would be happier long term being someplace that they were already comfortable in, rather than uprooting people and families and moving them someplace they were unfamiliar. So that was the number one reason. Sometimes we're geographic. Another reason that I sometimes had to tell people is that there's a big difference between leadership and managers. And so people growing up within the restaurant environment, oftentimes they were really good managers. They managed processes. They were able to manage the work, but they weren't the kind of leader that we were looking at that would grow from, that some of these restaurants grew exponentially in their sales volumes. Many of these leaders went from operating just one restaurant to two restaurants, and a few of them to three restaurants. So that's a different level of talent than just managing a shift in a restaurant. So that was another conversation that I often had to have. And I tried to be really truthful. I feel like it's kindness to tell the truth. And I had a mentor, Jimmy Collins, who was at one time president of Chick-fil-A. And Jimmy taught me this, okay? This is my favorite quote ever. It's kindness to refuse immediately what you eventually intend to deny. It's kindness to refuse immediately what you eventually intend to deny. And by the way, that principle works whether it's with your employees, candidates, or your own children. It's true. If you know the answer is no, tell them as fast as you can and tell them the truth. And I think that both protects your good name and the good name of the organization. So as much as possible, even when those conversations were hard, that's what I tried to do.
That's fantastic. Jimmy is outstanding as well. And I love his book, Followership. And I know that you guys teach that quite a bit. Can you talk just about followership and how that was important in the corporate culture?
Sure, Ken, don't let me forget what your question was, but I want to add one thing to something I just said, because of the people that have worked. This is really important, what I was talking about before. There's also this whole other side of talking to candidates that's the legal world. So I want to advise your listeners and those with us today, you need to consult your own legal people or your attorney about how you manage those conversations. Some would tell you differently than what I just said. I'm sharing with you how I managed it personally. And I think that's kindness, but sometimes there are parameters that are best for your business. And I just wanted to go back to that because I'm talking to CEOs and I don't want you all to go, well, Dee Ann said, and then end up in a bad situation. So I just want to be really clear about that. That's something that you need to be sure you connect with your own legal people about. Now, about followership. Yes, to be a really good leader, you need to start by being a good follower. You have used several times the example of the disciples. And I don't know how many of your listeners have seen the show The Chosen that's been on YouTube, but my husband and I have watched that during our quarantine. And the angle of this show has been so different. Now, I don't know how biblically founded it is, but it's their interpretation of these. And these men were just so average, and they had lots of flaws, by the way, just like us. I mean, Jesus had a lot of material to work with these guys. And but I think about what they did. What they learned to do for 3 years was follow. When you mentioned that earlier, it took 3 years for them to learn to follow, because then they were going to lead. They were going to found the church. They were going to preach the gospel for generations to come. And so those 3 years, I really think when you think about what Jesus did by example and what he taught them, they were learning to follow. And so the best leaders in my mind are people who are humble enough to be able to follow. And one of the ways we interpreted that in my experience was we're here to serve, and everybody serves somebody. And so if you have a servant's heart, then it makes you a much better follower.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question. And John wrote about, we were just talking about faith, and I know your faith is important to you and it's really guided your leadership. But John's question, and it's a question that sometimes Christian business owners struggle with. It says, when you're wanting to hire the right culture, do you seek out Christians, and without necessarily coming out and asking them, how do you know if somebody comes from a biblical perspective, or how did you look at that, and how does Chick-fil-A look at that?
So my experience in that is this, in as a business owner now, and as a leader for an organization, we know that religion is covered by Title VII. And so that was really, quite honestly, never what I would be looking for. I'm looking for people who match the values. And the values in this case are, we're here to serve, we're better together, we're purpose driven, and we pursue what's next. That's the list of the values. And whatever the mission is and whatever the purpose is in an organization. And so a lot of times what would happen in my experience at Chick-fil-A, I mean, I didn't usually know until after they were already selected, obviously, but like attracts like. And when Truett first started his business, he was selecting people from his church because those were the people he knew in his little business, and like attracted like. But in an organization, of, at the time I was there, 1,500 staff members, 1,700 staff members, and 2,000 franchisees, you're going to have all kinds of diversity and all kinds of background. But the important thing is, do we align around these important elements of the culture? Now, people can be influenced in all kinds of different ways once they become part of an organization. I saw that happen too. But there was, I honestly have to say, there was never any intentional intent to select anybody of a certain religion.
But I do think that and I agree with you. And obviously, part of, as we look at developing companies that have a kingdom impact, again, welcoming that diversity and allowing people to be exposed to kingdom ideas or Christian principles or biblical business principles, as I like to call them. But, I think, as you mentioned, having that even in your purpose, that are here, we're here to glorify God, right? That was pretty, that's a pretty strong purpose statement. And obviously you're attracting people to your values, and as they attract to that, then whether they're a Christian or not, that they're probably going to be a good fit for the culture. Hey, real quick, because I know we're almost out of time, I would just love for you to encourage the CEOs that are listening. I know you have a personal habit of spending the first hour of your day in devotional time or prayer time or with yourself to kind of get yourself
Right.
energized. Can you tell us how you discovered that habit and why you treasure that so much?
I sure can. So somewhere along my career, when my boys were probably at the most active ages, and so I had a husband and 3 young sons, and a highly responsible job at Chick-fil-A. The current president of Chick-fil-A, Tim Tasopoulos, was my boss, and he gave me some feedback. He said, I don't know what you need to do, but you need to focus on your positivity. And he said, so that when you get to the office, you're not, you're grounded, you're positive, you're ready to go. And I think a couple things came together. And so he told me what he did, and he shared, hey, I get up in the morning, I read something and I pray and I read a scripture and blah, blah, blah. He told me what he did. And so I started doing that as my daily habit, was to get up and I was doing those at the end of the day before I went to bed, instead of starting my day, because I had humans to get all kinds of places. I mean, my boys were spread out, so they were going to different locations every day. So, I mean, I had been like a Marine by the time I got to the office most days. And so that meant that I had to get up even earlier. If I was getting up at 5:30 then, to get that hour by myself was going to be 4:30 in the morning. Now, as they got older and more independent and could get themselves to school, I got to push that out a little bit. It wasn't forever, but it was the most important hour of my day. And it still is, even though I don't have to rush out the door every day. In fact, it's become more than an hour because I love that time so much. But starting with prayer, reading my Bible, listening to something uplifting. And then by the time I got to the office, oh, and by the way, I added exercise in there because that got those great endorphins going for me and my creativity. And I put that whole package together. And the funny thing is it wasn't too long before I actually was criticized for being too positive. Like, she's always positive about everything, but it changed my life just starting my day that way. And so I'm a big encourager of that. And I know we're out of time. I'll tell you one other thing that changed my life was because you didn't ask me the question and it was in the preview and I want to share it. The other thing that changed my life was the discovery of a verse of scripture. And it's an obscure verse in Hebrews. And we know the second part of the verse better than we know the first part, but it's simply this: see to it that no one misses the grace of God. Now, the rest of that verse that everybody knows is so that no bitter root grows up between you. But that first part really became my call in my corporate life. And so it's back to even what we were talking about before with it. I might encounter people, even though I was a person of faith and a Christian, I might encounter candidates and other people that weren't. See to it that no one misses the grace of God. The way I treat those people that work for me, the way I treat those candidates that come in, that became my personal purpose. And so all those things kind of came together to really transform my leadership. And I'm really thankful for God and for the people who spoke into me to help me become that person.
Wow, there's so much there to take away. I love that Tim had that conversation. I mean, what an authentic conversation, and just shows your self-improvement. And, as leaders, we're always looking to improve. And then you just gave us the key. I think that first hour of the day where, we're allowing God to pour into us so that we can go out and hopefully embody that as we go out. So I think that's real. And just that's a powerful, that was worth the story. And well, Dee Ann, you're just a fantastic author. You're an amazing leader. I'm so impressed by your books and so impressed by just your spirit and how you write and what you've done. Your book, I hate to even say this because I think it's worth full price. It's probably worth even more than what it costs. But right now, Amazon's running a special on it, on the Kindle version for $1.99. So if any of our listeners they can go to Amazon today and download the book. It'll be the best $2 that you've ever spent. But I do encourage you to bet on talent. I think it's a critical book for every CEO and every leader to have as they think through the corporate culture of their organization. And of course, even the human resource. So Dan, I love to say the words, well done. And you are a well done leader. So thank you for spending your time with us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Ken. And I hope that your listeners will connect with me on LinkedIn and Facebook and other places and follow the content as it continues to develop.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much.